In the heart of the Canadian wilderness, a group of high school boys found themselves on the edge of a mental breakdown. They had just spotted a DEA van stalking them through the forest, a sight that sent chills down their spines. These boys weren't just out for another hike. Their backpacks were stuffed with over 400 pounds of weed. For them, the stakes couldn't have been higher. But Nate Norman, the mastermind behind this operation, wasn't about to let the fear get the best of him. As he peered through the darkness, he realized that the DEA agents were sound asleep in their van. Taking full advantage of their good fortune, the boys quietly slipped away, making it home safely that night. For Nate, it was the easiest $500,000 he had ever made. But Nate's journey into the world of drug trafficking didn't start with a grand plan or a criminal ambition. It began in 2001 in a small town of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. At 19 years old, Nate was a high school dropout, living in his mom's house and working a dead-end job at Pizza Hut. The American dream had fell out of reach, and Nate had no clear path forward. That all changed one day when Nate and his friend Topher stumbled upon an article in High Times magazine. The article raved about BC Bud, Canada's finest marijuana, and the multi-billion-dollar business of smuggling it into the United States. Nate and Topher, both bored and directionless, saw an opportunity. Idaho was just a few hours from the Canadian border. What harm could one little adventure do? So in September of 2001, Nate and Topher made their first trip to Canada. It was almost a lark, a spontaneous adventure. They parked near some farm fields, walked across the border in broad daylight, and found themselves in a small town of Creston. As they wandered the streets, they encountered a man casually smoking a joint in the middle of the road. This is where they bought their first pound of BC Bud for $1,600 and smuggled it back across the border, selling it for enough money to buy 2 pounds the next weekend. The thrill of success was intoxicating. 2 pounds became 4, 4 pounds became 8, and before they knew it, they were hauling hundreds of pounds at a time. Nate and Topher had stumbled upon a gold mine. The money was easy, and the risk became minimal. With each run, Nate and Topher became more confident and more ambitious. They expanded their operation, bringing in more friends, including Ben Scarazzo, known as Scuzz. In just a few short months, they had accumulated over $150K in cash. Nate and his friends were living a life of excess: cars, toys, and parties, all fueled by the money that seemed to flow endlessly. But the thrill of the smuggling wasn't just about the money. For Nate, it was the adrenaline rush, the feeling of walking through the woods at night, the cat and mouse game with the border patrol. It's not the drug that's addicting, Nate would later say. It's the thrill that's addicting. And that thrill kept coming back time and time again. With each run, their operation grew more sophisticated. They developed a system: scout cars to check for law enforcement, camouflage to blend into the woods, and contingency plans in case something went wrong. They even left emergency caches of food and first aid supplies along the trails that they used the most often. But as their operation grew, so did their risks. It wasn't long before their activities caught the attention of law enforcement. Idaho State Police, the DEA, and even the FBI began to take notice. But the most chilling moment came not from the authorities, but from within their own world. In November of 2002, the body of a 20-year-old Brendan Butler was discovered on a dirt road near Hayden Lake. Butler, another young smuggler, had been running a competing marijuana operation. Believing he was losing business to Nate's group, Butler allegedly hired a crew from Southern California to rough up and possibly murder Nate and Scuzz. But before they could act, Butler was found dead, strangled, with his throat slashed open. For Nate, the discovery of Butler's body was a turning point. The thrill of smuggling runs and the rush of adrenaline was now overshadowed by the deadly reality of the drug trade. That's when it totally hit me, Nate said. This is serious business. The game had become more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and people were getting hurt, emotionally and physically. But even as the danger escalated, Nate couldn't bring himself to stop. The money was too good, the thrill was too intoxicating. He continued to expand the operation, bringing in 2 more friends, including his girlfriend, who became involved in the smuggling runs. Together, they formed a tight-knit group, each member playing a crucial role in the operation. By the time law enforcement closed in on Nate and his crew, They had smuggled an estimated 17,000 pounds of marijuana across the US-Canadian border, generating $38 million in cash. But the operation's success was also its downfall. The sheer scale of their activities made it impossible to stay under the radar, and the authorities were closing in. On November 10, 2002, at 4:45 a.m., the calm before dawn in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, was shattered by the cold efficiency of a police operation months in the making. Law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, including the DEA, FBI, and Idaho State Police, had prepared to take down one of the most unexpected criminal masterminds in the region, 21-year-old Nate Norman. The investigation into Nate's smuggling empire had become long and tiring. For months, law enforcement had been piecing together the puzzle, following every lead and tracking every move Nate and his crew made. Surveillance had revealed the intricate network they operated: scout cars, hidden caches, and well-timed runs across the border. But now, the time had come to bring it all crashing down. Nate was at home enjoying what he thought was just another night. After another successful run the week before, Nate had spent the evening indulging in the luxuries his illicit profits afforded him. A night out with friends, followed by a few quiet moments alone to savor the fruits of his labor. As he lay in bed, his mind wandered to thoughts of the future. He knew he was pushing the limits, but the thrill of the game kept pulling him back in. In those quiet moments before sleep, Nate considered the path he had chosen. The money was more than he had ever dreamed of, and the power that came with it was intoxicating. But beneath the surface, there was a growing unease. He had seen what the drug trade could do. Brandon Butler's death was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. Still, Nate convinced himself that he could handle it, that he was smarter than the rest, that he could walk away whenever he wanted. But even as Nate reassured himself, the cracks were starting to show. The pressure of maintaining the operation was taking its toll on him, on his relationships, and his mental state. The paranoia was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. Every shadow, every unexpected sound, every unfamiliar car on the street made his heart race. Yet the lure of the next big score, the next rush of adrenaline, was impossible to resist. As Nate finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep, the raid had been meticulously planned to catch Nate off guard, to strike when he was the most vulnerable. The officers knew that the element of surprise would be their greatest weapon. Nate was woken from his sleep by the sound of his front door being shattered. In that instant, everything changed. His mind, still foggy from the sleep, struggled to process what was happening. But as the shots of police filled the air and the blinding lights pierced the darkness, reality came crashing down. This was it, the moment he had always feared, but he had convinced himself would never come. Within seconds, Nate's house was swarmed by heavily armed officers. The confidence, the bravado, the sense of invisibility he had felt for so long vanished in an instant. Nate was taken into custody without a fight, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. As the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around his wrist, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The dream that had once seemed so sweet turned into a nightmare. Outside, the early morning air was crisp and cold, a stark contrast of the chaos unfolding inside Nate's mind. The officers continued their raid, tearing through his house and his mother's basement, where much of the operation had been controlled. They seized stacks of cash, marijuana, and the tools of Nate's trade: burner phones, encrypted laptops, and the detailed logs of every smuggling run he had ever made. It was a treasure trove of evidence that would seal his fate forever. With Nate in custody, the dominoes began to fall. His arrest set off a chain reaction, leading to the capture of his closest associates, Topher, Scuzz, and even his girlfriend, who had played a role in the smuggling runs. Each one of them was brought in, facing charges that would end their lives as they knew them. For Nate, the nightmare was only just beginning. In the following months, Nate and his crew faced a series of trials that captivated the small town of Coeur d'Alene. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and the families of those involved, all waiting to see how this tale of teenage rebellion, greed, and recklessness would conclude. Nate's defense was simple. He was no kingpin, just a kid who got in over his head. But the evidence was overwhelming. U.S. District Court Judge Edward Lodge, who presided over the case, saw through Nate's attempts to downplay his role. "I sentence you to 12 years, Lodge declared, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of how far Nate had fallen. While Nate was hit with the harshest sentence, the others received sentences ranging from 24 to 46 months. But their lives, too, were irreparably changed. For Nate, the sentence was a jolt, a brutal end to the life that he had built on lies and deceit. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the once promising future that had driven him to take such risks had vanished, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the next 12 years in federal prison. Behind bars, Nate had plenty of time to reflect on his choices. Nate Norman was released from federal prison in 2014 after serving several years of his sentence. Following his release, Nate transitioned into a legitimate lifestyle, now running a successful HVAC business in his hometown of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. His story, which highlights both his rise in the drug trade and his efforts at rehabilitation, was depicted in the 2014 film Cannabis. The movie, based on true events, was produced shortly before his release and brought renewed attention to his life and choices. So remember, every choice we make shapes our destiny, so choose wisely.